Good morning. I'm Eric Lee, director of the Campbell, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the opening of the special exhibition, Art and War in the Renaissance, the Battle of Pavia Tapestries. These magnificent, spellbinding tapestries, along with an important selection of arms and armor, are on loan from the Museo e Real Bosco de Capodimonte in Naples. They are among the greatest works of art produced during the Renaissance and have been called the Sistine Chapel of tapestries. This is the first time that all 7 Pavia tapestries have been shown in the Americas. The tapestries depict an epic battle that took place 500 years ago during the Italian wars between the military forces of the Habsburg ruler, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and the King of France, Francis I. The stunning victory for Charles V gave the Habsburg Empire geopolitical supremacy over Europe. We'll learn more about these masterpieces shortly. The exhibition was organized by the Museo e Real Bosco de Capodimonte and the Museum Box in collaboration with the Campbell Art Museum, the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, its second venue, and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, where the exhibition will be on view in 2025. The Campbell is grateful to the museum in Naples for these invaluable loans. We thank Carmine Romano, curator and head of digitization and digital catalog at the Capodimonte, who wrote an essay and edited the exhibition catalog, for the opportunity to work with him and his team throughout the complex installation. And Carmine has been in Fort Worth now almost 4 weeks, I believe, helping us install the exhibition, and we're just so grateful to him and to his team. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Thomas P. Campbell. He is a director and CEO of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, encompassing the DeYoung Museum in Golden Gate Park and the Legion of Honor in Lincoln Park. The exhibition will be on view in San Francisco beginning October 19th. Tom Campbell has served as director and CEO of 2 major U.S. art museums, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, from 2009 to 17, and the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco since 2018. There, he oversees the museum's dynamic and diverse exhibition, collection, and education programs. Tom is a distinguished art historian and leading expert on European tapestries. In fact, I saw just yesterday that if you ask ChatGPT who is the world's leading authority on tapestries, it answers correctly, Dr. Thomas P. Campbell. Tom was educated at Oxford University and London's Courtauld Institute of Art. He joined the Met in 1995 as curator in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts and as supervising curator of the Antonio Ratti Textile Center, a textile conservation center holding the museum's rich collections of textiles. No one has done more to bring critical and popular attention to tapestry, a principal but today often neglected art form. Tapestry Tom, as he is called with admiration, has garnered accolades worldwide for his study and promotion of the art of tapestry. Large, lavish, and hugely expensive tapestries were favored by the royal courts of Europe to glorify their rule. These immense, meticulously crafted textiles offered a platform for eye-catching narratives, including ancient history, mythology, and battle scenes, and a panorama celebrating the beauties of the natural world. Yet tapestries had long been overlooked by the public imagination in favor of paintings and other media. Tom conceived and organized the acclaimed exhibition Tapestry in the Renaissance, Art and Magnificence, which opened at the Met in 2002, followed in 2007 by Tapestry in the Baroque, Threads of Splendor, which was also shown in Madrid in 2008. The response to this sleeper exhibition on Renaissance tapestry was huge. It was a critical and popular success. Over 40 carefully selected tapestries including one tapestry from the Battle of Pavia series, were sensitively displayed to allow visitors to appreciate the masterworks that they are. The show received Apollo Magazine's Exhibition of the Year Award and the College Art Association's Alfred H. Barr Jr. Award for Museum Scholarship. Its catalog, universally praised for its wide-ranging analysis, remains essential reading today. And by the way, it's available on the Met Museum's website. This blockbuster exhibition was followed by an equally probing and beautiful exhibition of Baroque tapestries. We're all fortunate that Tom Campbell has championed the art of tapestry and set a very high bar, and that he has written a catalog essay for the present exhibition of the Battle of Pavia Tapestries. And we're grateful he's with us this morning to deliver the exhibition's inaugural lecture, Threads of Power, the Battle of Pavia Tapestries. Tom Campbell.
Eric, thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. Although I should say, don't rely too much on ChatGPT. They say it hallucinates and even makes things up. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning, and thank you, so many of you, for coming out on this beautiful day. So as Eric said, it's my pleasure to talk this morning about this wonderful set of tapestries. On March the 2nd, 1531, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, visited Brussels for the first time in 9 years. It was his first visit back to the Low Countries in 9 years. He'd been living in Spain. And the States General, who were the leaders of the Low Countries, on this occasion, took this occasion to present him with a set of tapestries. And as they were hung up, what he and the others saw, what was revealed to them, was a really splendid and unprecedented set of tapestries, the Battle of Pavia, which, as we've heard from Eric, commemorated this critical watershed in the struggle between France and the emperor's dominions over the balance of power in Europe, and especially in Italy. The French had long harbored a desire to win northern Italy, at the very least, and Francis, seeing himself as a young chivalric king, had been at the head of the French army conquering northern Italy. But on February the 24th, 1525, his army had been thrashed in a very rapid battle that really brought an end to medieval notions of warfare, cavalry charges, heavily armored knights hacking down their opponents, because the imperial army was well equipped with essentially what we call muskets, handheld guns that could penetrate armor. Many of the flower of the French army, the leading nobility, were killed. Francis himself was captured. And in one of the central panels of the tapestry, we see Francis, his horse having died from a shot from one of these guns, Francis being helped from his horse by imperial soldiers. This was the ultimate. I mean, he was noble, he was brave, but he was captured, and he was sent off to Spain for a year. It was the end of French ambitions in northern Italy. But not only did these tapestries record a critical historical event, they were themselves extraordinary, because never before had a historical event been reproduced at full scale, life-size figures, life-size horses, with such detail, such verisimilitude, such an illusion of the events unraveling, unfolding right in front of the viewer. It was extraordinary. And what I want to do this morning is to really talk about where did this come from? How did this groundbreaking set of tapestries come into being? But let's start with some of the basics, because tapestry is not really a very familiar medium nowadays. Tapestry is used precisely. Tapestry is a definition of a kind of textile where the design, the pattern, is 50% of the structure. Plain, so-called warp threads run in one direction, and colored weft threads are woven in and out of the warps to build up a pattern. So you see here a model, the weft threads going in and out, they get pushed down so they totally cover up the warp threads. The tapestries are woven on a loom, which can either be vertical. Here's an example in Rome at the Vatican. You see here the plain warp threads stretched between a roller down by the weaver's feet and a roller up at the top. These are the plain warp threads. And then the colors are wound on bobbins about the size of this projector, like the size of a pen. And the weavers pick up these bobbins where they want to use a certain color. They go back and forth and then tamp it down. The tapestry looms could always also be horizontal. And the advantage of this technique, which really comes to dominate tapestry weaving in the late Middle Ages, is that the weavers are following a full-scale design, which is called a cartoon. And with the low warp loom, the cartoon can be cut in strips and placed directly beneath the warp threads. So the weaver can see what they're weaving. It's right there. And the low warp loom actually really lends itself to the reproduction of very detailed designs. Tapestry becomes it's a simple technique. We know tapestries were made in the ancient world. Very little survives because, of course, as textiles, they're very vulnerable to the ravages of time, damp, moths, everything you deal with just with your cardigans and jackets at home, and they fade. But we know from written documents that during the Middle Ages, especially during the 1400s, a very sizable tapestry industry develops in the modern-day Belgium, in the Low Countries, and northern France, in towns like Arras and Tournai and Bruges and Lille, where there was very well-organized trade, rich merchants who could provide the advanced costs. Tapestries were very expensive, and lots of highly skilled weavers from the cloth trade, who then get drawn into the tapestry industry and are highly specialized. And tapestries from the Low Countries, we know, were being exported all over Europe, down to Italy, to Spain, to Britain, up into Scandinavia. They were an ideal form of decoration for the rich. They were portable. They could be carried from one castle to another. Because they were bespoke, patrons could commission elaborate designs that depicted the heroes they wanted to be associated with, even potentially depicting them. Many of you will know this famous illumination from the Très Riche of the Dukes of Berry, dating from the very early 15th century. And you see here a lord sitting at his high table with his servants cutting up his dinner for him. Behind him, a big fireplace. Let's zoom in. Big fireplace behind him. And up on the wall behind him, we see a huge tapestry hung from hooks with the coats of arms of the protagonists very prominently displayed, long inscriptions detailing what's going on. And it's an example of how impactful these tapestries were. You could send off your tapestries ahead of the royal party, and in the time it took to hang them up, you could transform a cold, damp interior into a richly colored setting, fit for a king, with messaging that aggrandized the owner. It was, in a sense, the propaganda of the day. Here's another image. This is the court of Charles VII. Here again we see huge armorial tapestries, great cloth of estate with the king sitting beneath it. There's a wonderful exhibition about the art of the court of Charles VII at the Musée de Cluny in Paris, if any of you are heading to Paris over the summer. Typically, does this hurt? It's like a kaleidoscope. This is a detail of one tapestry that depicted the story of Troy that was made in Tournai in about 1470, 1480. It's the central third of one tapestry of a set of 10. Each tapestry measures about 10 yards by about 4 yards high. So some of these tapestries these sets were enormous. And stylistically, in the mid to late 15th century, the style of design was almost kaleidoscopic. It was difficult for the weavers to create illusionistic effects. And instead, the style was almost cartoon-like, very two-dimensional, with a strong emphasis on pattern and decoration. But as your eye kind of explores what's going on, you will find, in this case, this is very violent battle scenes with people having their heads hacked off, and there will be inscriptions by the figures explaining who everyone is. Tapestries like this were designed really to kind of occupy the mind, occupy the eye, in the grand throne halls of the day, where people were often milling around for a long time, waiting for audiences. So these gave people something to look at and something to think about. And of course, you would have had courtiers who would have been there pointing out, this is what's going on, and just like King John, just like King Charles. Towards the end of the 15th century, Brussels becomes the center of very high quality production. This is a gold woven tapestry, one of a set of 4, that was made for Charles V's parents and is still in the Spanish Royal Collection. You see here the influence of contemporary Brussels painting, but it's still, the emphasis is very decorative. The different scenes are set within a retable-like structure. The gowns, the architecture have all sorts of detailing, precious stones, the illusion of precious stones, rich folds, and so on. So Charles's father dies young. Charles himself is a minor. So his aunt, Margaret of Austria, becomes the regent of the Low Countries. And during the early 16th century, the tapestry industry goes from strength to strength. One of the emerging designers is a young artist called Bernard van Orley, who was born in 1488. So by the 1510s, he's in his early 20s. He was a very successful artist. He came from a family of artists. He was well connected. He was very prolific. And quickly he becomes Margaret of Austria's court artist. And in fact, he is responsible for these portraits of the young Charles and of Margaret herself. There he is, handsome young man. And his workshop during the 1510s primarily concentrated on portraits of small religious pieces, like this beautiful painting of the Virgin and Child, really quite traditional, beautifully rendered, strong emphasis on texture, on the richness of materials, portraying, as was the style of the time, this religious concept as if it was taking place in the contemporary Low Countries. And we know that Van Orley also designed tapestries. The earliest tapestry that can be attributed to him is a set of 4 tapestries that was made for the imperial postmaster, Cardinal Erard de la Marck. And it depicts the fabulous, a story of a miraculous statue that was at a church called the Church of Notre Dame de Sablon, Our Lady of the Sands in Brussels. And the statue supposedly accomplished miracles. And here we see the young Charles himself carrying the sculpture on a bier. And here's Margaret of Austria with the patron of the tapestry. It's still very, let's go in for a detail. It's still very conservative in style. The emphasis is on pattern, on decoration. There's some illusion of depth, but essentially this is a continuity of the traditional style. So what was the decisive force that begins to change things? Well, the catalyst was a set of tapestries that Pope Leo X, seen here, commissioned from the young Italian artist Raphael. Leo wanted to, his predecessors had made the Sistine Chapel one of the most beautiful spaces in Christendom, not least the ceiling painted by Michelangelo between 1508 and 1512. And Leo wanted a set of tapestries that would go one step further than his predecessors and make the Sistine Chapel even richer. So he turned to Raphael to design a set of tapestries depicting Saints Peter and Paul, the founders of the Christian church. And Raphael, who was busy working on the frescoes in the Vatican stanza, Raphael and his assistants created a set of cartoons in about 1514 to 1515 that was sent to Brussels and were to revolutionize tapestry design. The popes had bought many tapestries in that more traditional style. But what Raphael saw was the potential of tapestry to create more ambitious, illusionistic scenes. And so the cartoons he painted in Rome in 1514-15 really were, they were an extension of the style he was developing in the Vatican stanza. Here's one of the cartoons. This shows the so-called miraculous draught of fishes, when Christ told his disciples to put their nets on the other side and they could barely pull them out of the water because they were so full of fish. And as you see, in place of the rich patterns of contemporary tapestry style, Raphael portrays large, muscular figures acting in large, open spaces. This was revolutionary, and it was very challenging for the weavers, because where a painter can just mix colors on the surface to go from dark to light to dark, to suggest shadow, highlight, shadow, to suggest volume and depth. The weaver can't do that. The only way the weaver can show such transitions of color is by building up lots of little triangles of color, going from one dark color into a medium color, into a lighter color, into a highlight. It's slow, time-consuming work. You can look at the tapestries here, you'll see these little hatchings. But they rose to the challenge. Here's one of these tapestries now at the Vatican, showing the conversion of Saul, when Saul is riding to persecute Christians, and is struck from his horse and has a vision of God and is converted, becomes Paul, eventually St. Paul. And here we see Saul shown as a Roman centurion lying on the ground, again in this big open space. There's a detail. You can see a little bit of the hatchings I'm talking about. This was difficult, slow, time-consuming work, but this was to light a fuse that was to change tapestry design. Now, the impact was not immediate. Oh, sorry, these are the Raphael tapestries in the Sistine Chapel. They were hung up in 2020 on the 500th anniversary of Raphael's death. And you see how dramatic, what a contribution they make to that space. Now, as I said, the influence was not immediate. For example, this is one of an enormous set of tapestries known as the Honours that was woven for Charles between about 1518, 1519, and 1523. So the Raphael tapestries had been woven in Brussels at that time. But this set, designed by Van Orley for Charles V, a great allegorical celebration of the virtues of the Habsburgs. There's no space here. It's that horror vacui. It's that intensely patterned, very dense narrative of the past. I'm not sure why this image looks so pixelated. It's a beautiful tapestry. It looks rather horrible here. But it shows how Van Orley continues initially. Maybe he designed this before the Raphael cartoons really were accessible. Maybe Charles wanted something that was more traditional. But from the early 1520s, we start to see him experimenting more. Here, for example, is one of a group of designs for a set of tapestries of the story of Romulus and Remus. And you can see here how he's following the example of the Raphael designs. He has large, dramatic figures, a sense of, deep figures in the foreground, figures in the middle distance, figures in the far distance, large architectural settings, neoclassical settings, classical settings in Van Orley's mind and mind of his contemporaries. Or here, this is one of a set of 4 tapestries depicting the Passion, dating from about 1525, 1526, that ended up in the collection of King Henry VIII in England. And you can see that In fact, there are a number of different influences here. This is the Last Supper. So we have Christ with the disciples, John, falling asleep on his shoulder, the table in front of them. This is the moment when he says, one of you will betray me. And all the disciples react in different ways, protesting their innocence, including Judas, who's got the money, has already been paid for betraying Christ. And what you see, I think, in this design is it's very dense, but there's a much stronger sense of perspective than in previous designs. We're looking down into the scene. Everyone is springing back from the table, and there are beautiful illusionistic details here, like the wine that the servant is still pouring. Oh, my things, oh, there we are. The wine, the servant is pouring into this glass, or the knife hanging over the edge of the table, or the veins standing out on the forehead of the servant, or the patting the marble of the floor. It's as if you can almost imagine a dialogue going on between Van Orley, this leading designer, the court artist to Margaret of Austria, and the dialogue he's having with the weavers and the merchants who are funding them, pushing the medium under the example of Raphael. And this is where we are. As I said, this dates from about 1525, 1526. So this is where we are in the tapestry industry. On the eve, oh, here's another scene from this set. This is of course, the crucifixion. We see Christ on the cross above, quite a traditional presentation of Christ, but below, the Virgin Mary fainting, held by two women, and this very muscular figure here, who's the man who's presumably nailed Christ to the cross. This figure is almost directly quoted from one of the Raphael designs. There you see on the left is the Raphael design, the stoning of St. Stephen, with this very muscular figure over here on the left. And this figure, and again, I'm not sure why this slide has come out so badly, because it doesn't look like this. This is a beautiful tapestry now at the National Gallery in Washington. And you can see how this very muscular figure is very much inspired by that Raphael figure. So this is where Van Orley was, mid-1520s. He's developing this sort of hybrid style that combines the muscularity, the drama, the perspectival spaces of Raphael, but with the continuing love of detail, of multiple narrative, having subsidiary narrative scenes in the background, and all sorts of decorative details. That's where he was at the time that the Battle of Pavia takes place, on the morning of 24th of February, 1525, which happens to be Charles V's birthday. We have this decisive historic event. News spreads throughout Europe like wildfire. And the event, Charles's victory, of course, he wasn't present, but the news of the event is spread through written accounts, through engravings, and even some paintings. Typically, these images tend to take a bird's eye view and are really quite schematic. They kind of try to sort of give an idea, a map of the layout, of the landscape, but they don't draw you in. Now, we don't know quite when this set of tapestries was commissioned, but when you think that the cartoons probably took a year or so to weave, each tapestry probably took about 2 years to weave, Maybe all 7 were woven at the same time, but that's unlikely. Commissions are normally broken down into tiers. So if the set is 7 tapestries, they probably wove 4 first and then another 3. So we're probably talking about a preparation time of about 5 years. And as the set was presented to Charles on March the 2nd, 1531, draw back 5 years from that, it's clear that this set of tapestries must have been, the idea must have been conceived really within 12 months of the battle. And it was in this commission that Van Orley really moves the industry forward, the tapestry industry, in this seismic way. The first step was to develop the scheme of the design. And he must have, given the detail in the tapestries, he must have spent considerable time with court advisors and people who had been at the battle, people who could tell him about the landscape, tell him about what happened, the events, because it all happened very quickly over the space of a few hours, describe to him the colors, the costumes, the banners, the armor, the arms of the people involved. And on the basis of that research, he developed 7 drawings that plot out a kind of panorama of the battlefield, almost like a grand sweep of the battlefield, with a sequence of events that took place during the battle. Large figures in the foreground, other events going on in the middle distance, and then other events, sometimes just life going on in the world around, sort of the Bruegel-like effect in the great distance. So these are 2 of these drawings. They're about 2 feet by 1 foot high. They're at the Louvre, and the Louvre Drawings Department, and we're actually going to be able to bring them to San Francisco when the tapestries come to San Francisco in the fall. Now, obviously, the paintings, the engravings are not like this. There are no tapestries like this. We've talked about the Raphael Acts of the Apostles, but there is no precedent for this sort of vision in tapestry design. And I think, in fact, the model for this were frescoes that the Raphael workshop was continuing to paint at the Vatican, particularly the frescoes in a room known as the Sala di Costantino, the room of Constantine, which depicts events from the life of Constantine. And the really grand one is the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where we see Constantine in the center and this vast battle, very violent battle going on around him. This was painted in about 1523-24 by Raphael's assistants Giulio Romano and Gianfrancesco Peni. And we know that at the same time they were designing these frescoes and executing them, they were also designing a set of tapestries that depicted the exploits, the feats of Scipio. The tapestries were not actually made for another 7 or 8 years, but the drawings seem to date from this period. And the reason this is important is that one of the Raphael workshop was going back and forth between Rome and Brussels in the early 1520s. And I think a man called Tommaso Vinciador, and I think he must have met with Van Orley, much as Van Orley met with Dürer in 1520. And I think that this must have been the idea, the model that inspired the structure of the Battle of Pavia Tapestries, this extended battle scene, seen from slightly above, a low bird's eye view, with the figures almost like a kind of very rich relief in the foreground, and then the middle and the far distance. It's an extraordinary feat of conception. As you look at the tapestries, you'll see they are just full of narrative detailing. After the lecture, when you come back, look, for example, at the detail I started the lecture with, of the tapestry where Francis his horse has been killed, he's being helped from his horse. In the tapestry, you'll see behind Francis, there's a groom holding two horses that are rearing with excitement. There's another man holding the tail of Francis's horse so that it doesn't roll over and crush the French king's legs as he gets away. There's so much detail. Or in this scene, where you have the scene of the town of Pavia behind, I think we don't know anything about Van Orley and his activities at this moment. So did he go to Pavia? We don't know. Maybe he sent an assistant. But someone made a very detailed rendering of the town of Pavia, which is then translated into this beautiful woven image, one of the most detailed townscapes that survives from the period. The next step was to translate those drawings into full-scale cartoons, the same size as the tapestries, which were then cut up and put on the looms in strips about a yard and a half wide. Cartoons very rarely survive. The fact that the Raphael Acts of the Apostles survive is extraordinary and a testament to the fame the regard in which they were held from the earliest times. Mostly cartoons got pretty much destroyed during the weaving process or were cut up. The only fragment from the Battle of Pavia cartoons that survives is this sweet head of a little dog that's being held by a woman running away in one of the scenes. And this is actually in the opposite direction to the way we see it in the tapestry, because the weaving process reversed the design. So when the artists were creating the cartoons, they had to make the cartoons the reverse of the orientation they wanted the tapestry to be. So we imagine Van Orley, all this consultation, developing these designs, then working with a team of a number of assistant artists, making these cartoons, and then the cartoons being handed over to the workshop, which was run. It was a workshop of two tapestry entrepreneurs called Jan and Willem de Moyen. They made some of the most beautiful tapestries of the era. They were in Brussels. This is their mark that appears on some of the tapestries. And between 1526-27 and 1531, these 7 tapestries were woven sequentially, pushing the Brussels weavers to reproduce illusionistic scenes of a scale and an ambition that they had never had to do before. If this was a fresco, it would be one of the most famous frescoes in the world because of its achievement. But I think because it's a work of art made in tapestry, and tapestry is an art form that's really been neglected, overlooked in the Western canon, it hasn't received attention it truly deserves. And that's why seeing these tapestries here in Fort Worth, and then in San Francisco, and then in Houston, on the 500th anniversary of this battle, is, I think, so exciting. This is Francis I, the French king, leading the imperial troops snuck up on the French overnight, and at dawn they emerged from the woods. And the French cavalry, initially, they charged out thinking that this would be a walkover. There's, in the background, there's Francis I killing one of the imperial generals. And here he and some of his aides-de-camp are galloping forward. But, as I mentioned at the beginning, you see the soldiers with their guns emerging from the woods. And this was the decisive factor in this battle. The guns brought down the cavalry. And very quickly, the French army was a patchwork of mercenaries. One of the early events was the Swiss mercenaries were on the French side, panicked, threw down their pikes. Ooh, and you see here the French soldiers throwing down their armaments. One brave general, Johann von Dean, refused to surrender, and here he is about to be killed by an imperial soldier. Here another scene, very, very redolent of the Sala di Costantino fresco I showed you. This vast panorama as the imperial troops sweep towards the French cavalry. The French cavalry aren't able to fire because they're worried they're going to hit their own troops. Here in the background, we see one of the imperial generals, who's actually the ancestor of the Naples family to whom these tapestries end up being given in the mid-16th century. Another of the imperial generals here, leading his troops forward. Over on the right, some of the French generals being slaughtered in this very, very violent battle scene, clearly based on vivid eyewitness accounts. Here, the tapestry with Francois I's capture. There are different theories about how these tapestries were displayed. To my mind, the fact that this tapestry is in a way, the kind of the fulcrum of the whole battle, the capture of the king, and that in this tapestry, it's the only tapestry where we have people looking directly out at us, including this figure in the center, who we don't know who he is. It's been said he might be Charles de Bourbon, one of the imperial generals. But in fact, Bourbon is shown over here with very different insignia on his horse. So we're not quite sure about that. But because this is the only scene where people are looking directly out at us, I think this might have been a centerpiece. And then the other tapestries run along the sides of the hall on either side. But it's, of course, tapestries were a movable feast. They could be shown in many different ways. This is the scene where the woman has the little dog. You just see it running away. These are civilians escaping from the French camp as the imperial troops advanced. Vast explosions, absolute panic, people trying to control the mules. There's some beautiful princely lady or courtesan being escorted away quickly. And then just the sheer panicked flight of the French before the vanguard of the imperial soldiers. Here, the great scene of Pavia behind, the French troops desperately trying to escape, swimming across the Ticino River, where so many of them are to drown. And in the final scene, the French who do escape, led by a general called Alençon, who becomes a byword for cowardice thereafter. And here we have the rear guard of the French trying to break up the pontoon bridge over which the French have escaped. It's quite extraordinary. As I said, nothing like this before. This anticipates the grand panoramas that we see in the 17th and 18th century. But this is absolutely groundbreaking in its scale, in its ambition, in its verisimilitude, and it sets a model that is to be hugely influential for tapestry design in the coming years. Just to give you one example, this is almost a complementary set that was made for Charles V by the same weavers, also from designs by Van Orley. It's known as the Hunts of Maximilian, and it survives at the Louvre Museum in Paris. And it shows Charles and his family hunting in the woodlands around Brussels. So if the Battle of Pavia shows Charles victorious in battle, the hunts show him victorious in the pursuits of peacetime. There is Charles on a horse that's rearing with beautiful landscape of Brussels in the background. This is Charles's brother, Ferdinand, who is about to kill this enormous wild boar. Again, one of these slides that hasn't worked, so let's go to the next. You see the exquisite detailing. This is one of the great treasures at the Louvre. Not very well shown because the lights are terribly close to the tapestries, so you don't really see, you see a lot of shadow on the surface of the tapestries, but still worth making a pilgrimage to next time you're at the Louvre. So there we have Charles surrounded by the most incredible tapestries, including the Battle of Pavia, really using tapestry as a medium of propaganda. Other kings could not commission such overtly triumphalist imagery because literally it would not have been allowed. There was very active persecution in Brussels in the 1520s and 1530s of anybody who wasn't Catholic, who wasn't towing the party line. But the other kings got around it in different ways. For example, Francois Ier, King Francis, when he was eventually released from prison in Spain, his ambitions to extend French territory to take over Italy had to stop, but instead he transferred his love of Italy into collecting Italian works of art. This is one of a set of tapestries that was made for him that's a trompe-l'oeil reproduction of the famous plaster and painted gallery at Fontainebleau that was made for him by Primaticcio and other Italian artists. And in this scene, this allegorical scene, we see King Francis in the center. This was made at Fontainebleau, this set of tapestries. So he actually set up his own tapestry manufactory. Most other kings were dependent on Brussels. Henry VIII, for example, bought huge numbers of tapestries, richly woven with gold, from Brussels. He couldn't buy tapestries that directly celebrated him, so instead he bought tapestries that celebrated the Old Testament patriarchs and New Testament prophets, who he was presenting himself as the modern-day successor to. So here are 3 tapestries from an incredible set of the story of Abraham that still hang at Hampton Court today. So really, just to conclude, I hope I've given an idea of the importance of tapestry during this era, the degree to which the Battle of Pavia Tapestries were an extraordinary innovation in their time, and the way that they were a watershed in tapestry design in Brussels in the late 1520s and early 1530s, at a moment that was really the golden age of European tapestry production. Thank you very much.